Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of the Lincoln Fellowship of Pennsylvania's new Conversations with a Lincoln Scholar series. I am Ashley Luskey. I serve on the board of the Lincoln Fellowship of Pennsylvania, and I am also the Assistant Director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. And today you are being treated to not only a conversation with a Lincoln Scholar, but conversation with a spousal Lincoln Scholar, because today's guest is actually my husband, Dr. Brian Luskey. He is a professor of history at West Virginia University, and he specializes in 19th century America, Civil War, antebellum, history of capitalism, as well as Lincoln. So today we are going to be talking about an element of his most recent book, Men is Cheap, Exposing the Frauds of Free Labor in Civil War America, specifically as it pertains to Lincoln, who looms heavily in that book. And before we get started talking about specifically Lincoln, the draft, and free labor ideology, I would just like to remind you that although this conversation is being pre-recorded, we are going to be following up this session with about a 15-minute or so live question and answer. So we encourage you to write in with your questions, and Brian will be on to join us afterwards to answer them. So Brian, let's get started talking about Lincoln and the draft as it pertains to free labor ideology. Can you just kind of orient us, give us kind of a general background, a general timeline to when the draft was instituted, why it was instituted, and kind of the framework around which it was first put into place?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Ashley, in our home. And to all of you out there, I look forward to our discussion, our Q&A after this. The draft was instituted in March of 1863. Congress passed a piece of legislation called the Enrollment Act. That was necessary because voluntary enlistments had declined in the United States, and this is a particularly difficult point in the war for Union Army. So it's kind of at a low point of wartime feeling, positive feeling among the populace generally. So as Lincoln said in a memorandum that he wrote and never issued, but it's kind of in response to the violence of the subsequent summer in opposition to the draft, he writes a memorandum about why the draft was necessary. And he says there are a lot of reasons why men might enlist for war. They may have nothing else to do. It may be about ambition for advancement and glory. It may be for patriotism. It may be because they need a job. But all of these reasons are incentives to be part of the Army. But increasingly, as battlefield casualties and as the popular kind of feeling for the war ebbs in late 1862 and early 1863, there comes to be this need to have a more coercive sort of system whereby men were conscripted.
Right.
Yeah.
And can you talk about, you mentioned the violence that occurred as a result of the draft. Can you talk about kind of what fed into that? What are the reasons why people are so in opposition to the draft, and where do we find these pockets of resistance?
Yeah, certainly. I should say that the legislation itself had a number of exemptions, including they treated married and single men differently. If you were the only remaining son taking care of an elderly parent, you might be exempted. But the more controversial exemptions included the commutation clause, which allowed people with $300 who had been drafted to pay $300 to the government and be released from service, or they could hire a substitute. And that was, I think, the most controversial exemptions. And you see a lot of violence erupting in northern cities, most famously New York City, Boston, and other places.
Right. And of course, to us, thinking about 19th century terms of money, $300 seems like a lot of money. And of course, to a lot of people, it was a lot of money, especially to Irish immigrants who, couldn't necessarily pay that $300 to find a substitute. They would have to go into the war. And of course, there were racial tensions too. The Emancipation Proclamation has just, come into effect. And so people feel like, well, we're being forced to fight for or pay this exorbitant fee for a cause that we don't fully believe in. It's not just about union anymore. It's also about emancipation. And not everyone was on board with that by any means. So Lincoln had a different view as to why the $300 commutation fee was necessary. Can you kind of walk us through his particular views on that?
I can. Lincoln believes that commutation fee is completely fair. And in fact, what it does is to keep the price of substitutes low. That is to say that if the commutation fee was excluded from the legislation, that would create a much more competitive market in substitutes. That would make the price of hiring somebody to serve in your place much more, and therefore take away an exemption for men who had the $300. So it's in some ways an arbitrary amount of money. It constitutes basically a little bit more of what a day laborer in an urban environment would make, working seasonally, might make $1 a day, might work 250 days a year. A tradesman or a dry goods clerk might make substantially more than that, but $300 is still a lot of money. Right. But you see the most impoverished urban dwellers as being the kind of quintessential opponents of this. But it's important to say that Lincoln understood that the consequences of taking away commutation would lead to an even more detrimental consequence to poor and to middle class people who have been drafted. It would take an option away from them to pay this money and be released from service.
Sure. And of course, that's where the whole debate about free labor ideology comes in, right?
Sure.
And before we get into that, maybe you could kind of set us up with what is free labor ideology, especially as opposed to Southern slaveholding society, and how did those two societies view each other and view kind of the merit of the worker and the place of the worker?
Right. Free labor ideology really takes shape in political terms in the 1850s, coalescing in this new Republican Party coalition in opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the concerns that white Northerners had about the spread of slavery into the Western territories. What the proponents of this ideology propose is that wage labor is superior to slavery because it gives workers the opportunity to earn wages, to save those wages, and eventually to become independent proprietors of landed property or business property, and eventually to hire workers of their own. So it's a system supposedly that is providing incentives to save and to be socially and economically mobile, and it's a kind of a self-fulfilling system in that sense that independent people can hire workers so that they can become independent someday too in adulthood. The concern is that if slavery is allowed to expand into the Western territories, this system of wage labor would have trouble competing with a system in which workers were treated as commodities, as property, who could not advance through wage labor. And the concern is that white Northern men would be rendered dependent politically and socially on a slaveholding aristocracy.
Right, right. And can you talk to us a bit about the famous mudsill theory proposed by James Henry Hammond?
Sure.
And how Southerners kind of justified having a slave class to do the most menial manual labor as opposed to having to rely on a white mudsill class.
Yeah. James Henry Hammond is a protege of John C. Calhoun, by the late 1850s, a senator from South Carolina, and he gives a speech in the Senate. And it's really a speech that is in part related to the tensions that have unfolded in Kansas between the pro-slavery border ruffian element and the free soil kind of combatants of them trying to vie for control of the Kansas territory. But what Hammond says, and it's coming out of a financial panic in the fall of 1857 that had hit the northern economy a great deal harder than the southern one. That no power on earth dare makes war on cotton. Cotton is king. And the way in which cotton had become king was to rely upon a mudsill class, a class moored, fixed to the floor of society. And Hammond said that every society needed such a class if there was to be a class kind of put in kind of the opposite of that mudsill class, a class that was defined by civilization, right? And in Hammond's mind, it was quite a blessing given by God that the slaveholding South had supposedly, according to Hammond, an inferior class of people to be that mudsill class, defined by race. But something that Hammond said that was a bit more shocking to many Northern ears. I think a lot of white Northerners would have agreed that there was a racial distinction based upon superiority and inferiority. But what Hammond also said is, in the North, there's a mudsill class too, and there's a fixed class of waged workers moored to the floor, and basically you don't call them slaves, but you might as well.
Wage slaves.
That's right. Well, and certainly that kind of lingo was used by white Northerners themselves over the course of the pre-Civil War period. So I should say, this is probably a good moment to say that free labor ideology, as proposed and promoted by Republican politicians like Lincoln, was an effort to rehabilitate wage labor, because wage labor in the early republic kind of made people think about political dependence, and that wage laborers, when they were wage laborers, were not independent people. They were dependent on a boss to pay them. Right, so there's a moment there where the concern is these people, wage earners, can't be citizens. And as economic change and industrialization unfolds in the North in the early 19th century, driving wages down, splitting labor tasks apart so that no worker is making an entire product in an artisanal model, they're not becoming independent. So there's a lingering concern, even among Northerners, that Hammond is right in the sense that wage workers were not advancing to independence. Certainly, they were not slaves. There is a very clear difference. But white Northern workers liked to make the comparisons to African American slaves in the South because it worked for them politically. That white men should not be treated like this.
Right. So Abraham Lincoln believed very strongly in what he called the race of life, that people will always find a way, if they worked hard enough, or at least most people would, to somehow break free of that dependence and escape from, a strict wage labor, kind of living. How is it that so many people who doubted what free labor could actually shell out to them in the end, how is it that so many of them could rally around free labor ideology and go to war for it and sustain that motivation and that support for the war, especially when things are flagging on the battlefield? How did they get behind it and still follow Lincoln and say, he's our guy?
Yeah. Well, there are other ideals that support their doing so. I think the first thing to say is that Lincoln made this transition himself,
Right.
from wage earning rail splitter to independent professional lawyer. Right. That's kind of a symbol of upward mobility and the advancement through achievement, right? And so that's there are several men like Lincoln. I mean, it's not an uncommon thing to see in society. So certainly people believe it might work for them, even as and I think it's kind of hard for many observers and people participating in economic life in the middle of the 19th century to understand the broader trend that you can see that a greater percentage of the population after the Civil War is employed by somebody than before the war. There's a very clear distinction between 1850 and 1870. So they're living this moment of change, and they can't really see it. Right. But I guess in addition to the capital R Republican political ideology around free labor, you have these small r Republican values that call men to serve their country and the common good. And that is in itself a proof of their virtuous citizenship and their independence to make that choice. So I think it's both, they're fighting for free labor. And in fact, a lot of them, there's one soldier I cite in this book who describes at Malvern Hill, he and other members of the mudsill class of the North, they take on that label for themselves, even though they're appalled by being called mudsills when they're mowing down the ranks of the Southern aristocracy. But they all consider themselves, virtuous citizens who are voluntarily, by free choice, deciding to serve their country. This is the obligation of citizenship, that it's not just about rights, it's about a sense of obligation.
Sure. So then let's get to the draft as it intersects with free labor ideology, because of course the subtitle of your book is Exposing the Frauds of Free Labor in Civil War America. So what is it about the draft and the different characters that come into play to facilitate the draft and make sure that the numbers of men are generated and put into the ranks? What is it about that exposes the frauds of free labor?
Yeah, that's at the core of the book. I think I need to say, though, that a lot of historians have shown, and rightly so, that the draft didn't work. Right? There were many men drafted, a few actually came to service. But what the draft does that maybe we don't really fully understand is it provides an incentive to volunteer. So I've got to explain that, because that's on the face of it maybe a little confusing. Each community was given a quota of men they had to enlist at each draft call, and I think there were 4 of them over the course of the war after this draft act was passed in March of 1863. So each community had a responsibility to find men, and the way to do that was not just to wait till the draft happened. You wanted to prove as a community that you were still virtuous and you still felt that sense of obligation. So there were many ways to do that. And what we see over the course of the second half of the war is not only the draft happening, but accompanying that, the rise in the amounts given by local communities for what were called bounties. These were payments that were promised to soldiers to serve. So in some ways, you can see the draft as providing a new economic incentive. And this kind of plays into free labor ideology in a way. These are even more wages on top of what a soldier would make month to month, which was $13 a month, and that put them on par with a private in the Union Army, with an agricultural laborer. In terms of wages. But if you give them several $100s as a bounty, well, that starts to sound a lot better. And communities instituted new taxes. They issued financial instruments like bonds to raise the money to pay these bounties. So I think that's the first thing. That's an incentive that kind of, feeds into this kind of, how might workers get ahead?
Yeah.
But the other thing is that by the middle of 1864, so 15 months, say, after the draft was passed, Congress bent to the popular pressure, people saying, this is a rich man's war, poor man's fight, we got to get rid of the commutation clause, and Congress did. And what happened, Lincoln was right. It created this wild market in substitutes, and to manage that, the government relied upon private businessmen and officials in the Army to kind of serve as brokers, called bounty brokers or substitute brokers, who would connect drafted men and substitutes in an anonymous market that was regional and even national in some cases. So you have these brokers going far afield from places where quotas need to be met, and you have town and county commissioners going out, and if they're in upstate New York, they might go to the city of New York or to Brooklyn and to the Navy Yard, where this was a kind of a rendezvous of brokers and agents, and try to get men from the city to serve their quotas. By the middle of 1864, you have northern agents venturing into southern states to recruit and enlist recently freed African-American men to meet local quotas back north. That became legal. But I sense what you're saying is you want to talk about the frauds, and this is the long answer, is that these substitute brokers became quite adept at convincing substitutes, men who might be substitutes, to join them on a walk to the recruitment station, to the recruitment rendezvous, and on the way, why don't we get a drink, right? And they duck into a tavern, and several drinks later, these men would pass out, awaken in camp on Hart's Island or Blackwell's Island, I can't remember the island, in New York Harbor, and realize that they've been cheated out of the bounty that was owed to them. So that's one example of the way substitute brokers work, but they were really adept in also selling town commissioners slips of paper with men's names on them that supposedly connected them to a substitute who was far away, when in fact that person didn't exist. So the government starts to get concerned about the ways in which these substitute brokers were cheating them. But on the other hand, the government, in other cases that I talk about in this book, the government feels like they need these substitute brokers. If they didn't have this middleman doing the work of connecting substitute to drafted man, then they couldn't get enough men into the Army, which is the ultimate kind of goal.
Right, and you say in your book that these middlemen, these labor brokers, people love to hate them because they represented everything wrong and imperfect about so-called free labor ideology.
Yeah.
And yet, on the other hand, they had to kind of turn their head a little bit at it because they needed this job. They needed these men to be, put into the ranks.
Yeah.
And also these men would also provide domestic workers for families at home whose, the husband would go off, to fight in the South, and, the wife would be left at home and need assistance, and they're suffering. And there's a concern that, fighting in this war and being, dependent upon the government for a soldier's wage is going to, in the long term, hurt the home front and one's own family fortunes.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about that too,
Yeah.
about these domestic workers who are funneled into the system?
Definitely. Substitute brokers represent a proprietor of a business that was well known in antebellum cities called the intelligence office keeper. And the intelligence or information that was bought and sold in these offices was information about the labor market. And particularly in the antebellum period, the people being connected were household mistresses and domestic servants, mainly middle and upper class native-born women who worked in, who lived in homes, and Irish immigrants who were looking for work in that capacity in northern urban homes. And so to have servants as a northern family registered your success, your kind of the outcome of free labor ideology in a way. And a lot of soldiers take that idea with them. And so when they encounter African American women and children in refugee camps, in their own camps, like they think of them in terms of how can these people's labor benefit my family, and kind of augment our sense of respectability and refinement, right? And like our social status. So the substitute broker represents a kind of an aspect of labor brokerage more generally, and it reflects the problem more generally. So yes, labor brokers were hated because they were thought to both cheat workers. They would promise them in payment for a fee that they would find them a job. If they didn't find them a job, the labor broker could say, it's not my fault, it's the market. Like, there just aren't jobs available.
Or they skim a little off the top, or say, oh, you'll get your installment later, and then all of a sudden they'll disappear.
Of course. Yeah. And you've got household mistresses also complaining about the labor broker because they supposedly fed them workers who were lazy, disobedient, truculent. It's just, so everybody had a complaint about the labor broker, and yet the labor broker was absolutely necessary in an anonymous market of labor in which people don't know each other. You can't, sometimes, if you could, you'd work through networks of friends. But that's kind of as the city becomes more anonymous and classes of people are living in different parts of the city, that becomes impossible. So you need these brokers if you want this sort of labor. But and to
sustain the war effort too, because obviously it's not only to provide soldiers to fill the ranks, but to enable families who are stuck at home to survive the war, and to still believe that things will turn out in their favor, that free labor ideology can work, they can still be independent, they can still be respectable. They need that support coming from the home front.
That's right. And so despite the labor broker being a hated figure, that's kind of the model that Northerners continue to use, whether the interest is in getting soldiers for the army or domestic workers for the home. So you have many thousand free people from upper South states like Virginia, North Carolina being funneled to northern cities like Philadelphia. That's what I talk about in my book. And later, after the war, through the offices of the Freedmen's Bureau in Washington, D.C. These are people who are looking for work, in many ways looking for the promise of free labor for them so that they can become independent. But employers in the North are looking for the next population of obedient workers. The Irish immigrants don't seem to be working out, and they bring Irish immigrants and recently freed African Americans into competition with each other for places. But they have these strange, to us, this strange sense that the slaveholding aristocracy is a great danger to our freedom because of the system that they managed and profited from. But on the other hand, they consider formerly enslaved people as a particularly obedient population who might serve to make their own homes more refined and respectable. So that's kind of the goal behind this, and it creates this trade in people's labor that not a few observers think looks a lot like the antebellum slave trade, even though it wasn't. But that's kind of the frame of reference that people use to understand it.
Yeah, and you mentioned that these labor brokers, they took on so many different roles and kind of identities, that they played the clerk in some regards in terms of, you know, keeping the books and often, you know, messing with the books. They played the role of almost the slave auctioneer in terms of, you know, making sure that their soldier substitute, if he wasn't quite up to health standards, that they would just keep taking him around to different, you know, stations until a doctor cleared him and said, oh, you're good to go into the army, even though maybe he probably wasn't. They played all different kinds of roles in society, roles that people were familiar with, sometimes obviously opposed to them in the North, thinking about, you know, the slave auctioneer, you know, pushing bodies, especially white bodies, out into service fraudulently. But they were roles that people were culturally familiar with, which is intriguing.
For sure. The title of the book, I realize it's grammatically incorrect. It's a quotation from a substitute broker who's writing to his bosses in New York City to tell them that the substitute market at that point was depressed, and so the price that town and county commissioners were willing to pay had gone down, and so this was not a good moment for brokers to be pushing men. They should wait until men is expensive.
Right.
Again.
Right. And of course, Lincoln himself, he knew that this was happening. The government knew that this was happening, that there were these fraudulent transactions, that, you know, the draft, especially when getting back to specifically soldiers, was imperfect. And yet he had a very reasonable explanation for it, right? It was that, you know, this might bring up questions about free labor and dependence upon wage work for a short amount of time, but in the long run, it's going to achieve independence and true freedom from the market. But as you said, after the war, there are more people who are employed as wage laborers than ever before. So how does that kind of fit with Lincoln's prophecy for the long-term future of free labor ideology?
Yeah, there's a lot of things I wanted to say. Now I'm losing them. Lincoln, we should say that the federal government tried to crack down on the substitute market's worst excesses. The War Department sent Detective Lafayette Baker to New York City to investigate the way in which the frauds worked and to crack down on bounty jumpers, the soldiers who cashed in a bounty and then absconded and then re-enlisted for a new bounty. And on substitute brokers, and they captured many of them in Hoboken, New Jersey, in a sting in the winter of 1865, early spring of 1865, and sent many of them to the old Capitol prison. I do want to say that even though Stanton, the War Secretary, James Fry, the Provost Marshal General, and Lincoln thought these men were necessary, they tried to stop the worst excesses of the market. The tension here, I think I would lean back on my distinction between the capital R Republican Party ideals of free labor ideology and the small r Republican ideals of virtuous citizenship. I mean, Lincoln is very clear that in order to sustain the Republican institutions of the country, more men was needed. He says in this memorandum on the draft, an army needs men. It's at its most pragmatic, right? And you can see that not only in that memorandum, but in his later responses to the political allies, more conservative Republicans in the Union Party coalition in the build-up to the election of 1864, who are trying to get him to go back on the Emancipation Proclamation, revoke the Emancipation Proclamation, and you're going to get all of these new white voters in the North to vote for you.
Right.
And he said, absolutely not. That's absolutely ridiculous. Don't you know, at that point in the war, he's talking about 150,000 African American men serving in the Union military. That would go up to close to 200,000 by the end of the war. But he doesn't lose that pragmatism, and that may trouble us too. He says in one of the responses to these letters asking him to revoke the Emancipation Proclamation, it's a question of manpower, as much as if it were horsepower or steam power. You have to have men in the army, white and black. Certainly, you can't revoke the Emancipation Proclamation without these African American soldiers throwing down their arms and saying, "I'm not going to fight for you anymore."
And that's always been part of the allure and fascination with Lincoln, is that he appeals both to people who believe in his idealism, and he was idealistic, but he was also pragmatic.
Yeah.
And so he managed to balance those two, sometimes leaning on one more than the other, but ultimately intertwining them for a successful prosecution of the war effort.
Yeah. I don't have an ultimate answer for you in terms of where does the self-made man ethic correspond to historical reality. In some ways, you could say it goes back to Franklin and beyond, right? That it's an ethic that works for some, but not all, right? Certainly, industrial workers after the war, they are responding to the economic constraints of the period when they go out on strike in the 1870s, violently so, and they're cracked down on violently by the American military. Old Army commanders like Winfield Scott Hancock in the Department of the East is sending soldiers at the behest of President Rutherford B. Hayes, himself a former soldier, to stop the railroad strike of 1877, for instance. So there's and so the kind of the reasons are the concerns about kind of European socialism infecting the United States. But what a lot of these workers would say is what we want is that old small r Republican ideal of economic and social autonomy and independence. Right. So that conversation, debate, continues beyond Lincoln and Hammond, and I would say, or beyond Lincoln and working class leaders in the North who would have thought Lincoln was naive,
right,
in the pre-war period too. But I got to say, in Lincoln's defense, this ideology came out of his own experience. I mean, I think that's very clear. It's hard for him not to talk about the race of life. He felt like he had run it and won. Right.
Are there differences between how soldiers viewed their service as quote unquote wage laborers, being drafted and then receiving these bounties, versus the civilian population's view of soldiering, in terms of soldiering as a job? Yeah,
that's a good question. I guess what I would say is that whether they admitted it, acknowledged it or not, the economic imperative of soldiering was always there from the beginning of the war. The federal government gave a $100 bounty starting in May of 1861. Soldiers had to weigh the economic factors along with the idealistic ones of why to serve, right? Are you going to make that $13 per month? Maybe your state is providing a certain amount of money to wives and children to help them live through the war in some state of comfort, or at least not in suffering. There's a lot of concern over the course of the war among soldiers who are worried about the economic status of their families.
Right.
And getting them a domestic servant is merely one aspect of that. It's mainly about, keeping food on the table and coal in the stove,
right.
And I think that for people at home, I think they equally so are concerned about access to soldiers' wages, and that's why a system called the allotment system was created, whereby soldiers could sign away their wages and have the various private and public institutions hold that money so that families could get access to it. So I think that certainly they do see this, whether you're in camp or at home, you're seeing this as it would be hard to ignore the economic imperatives of it all. The kind of the dollars and cents issue.
Yeah, and that's not to say that these guys were mercenaries only, and that this was only an economic issue.
But that was a concern.
There was
right?
There's a very pragmatic blend of economics and the ideals, political ideals. There's as you said at the beginning, all kinds of reasons why these guys are signing up.
Mm-hmm.
And then for those who return home, I'm sure it's a very varied story. Some of them return home to a much different blighted financial situation. Some of them return home and are able, depending on their own physical abilities after the war, to kind of rehab themselves and pick up almost where they left off. But then also for the widows, this creates a whole different system of dependence upon the government, which I imagine would also rub up against those ideas of free labor ideology and kind of being independent of the government.
Sure.
Giving you a handout, but if you apply for a pension and you get it, that's something that a lot of people weren't used to having to rely on the federal government for.
I think that's probably more true for the veterans than for the widows, because women were thought it was suitable for women to be dependent in this period of time
upon the government versus.
Well, I guess it's kind of it's transposing. Yeah, it's transposing one form of dependence for another. So
right.
I think that's an interesting distinction. What I should also say is I did a lot of research on this, but it didn't get in this book. They're kind of the class of lawyers and others who serve as claim agents.
Right.
For people who have to try to navigate this government bureaucracy, who claim special knowledge of the systems. One of them I studied was a paymaster during the war, and he may get into the next book. But he all along is a lawyer in southern Ohio along the Ohio River. And his law partner is circulating paperwork between applicants for pensions, bounty payments with the second auditor's office in the Treasury Department. And they kind of clarify the system. They help people get their money, but they get a fee. They get a cut of whatever the people get from the government too.
Right.
So that's, there's always a middleman.
Right. Right. And I guess thinking about it too from a racial standpoint, these newly emancipated slaves, or slaves who had, found their own freedom by running away to contraband camps and refugee camps, who then either get kind of impressed into service or cajoled into it. Maybe they don't necessarily want to go into service. They need to for financial reasons, or they get tricked into it by someone with a heavy hand. That obviously has to sit heavy with them too, coming from slavery, thinking, I'm going into freedom now. And then all of a sudden they're, enlisted into the ranks, and it's not the same as slavery, but it's not exactly the life of freedom that they had been promised, that they had heard Lincoln speak of, that they thought that the Union Army was going to provide and was fighting for.
Yeah. In my book, I talk about one case of impressment wherein a Union colonel, John Nelson, of the 10th United States Colored Troops, gets court-martialed for illegally impressing African-American men into service. What the testimony in that case shows is the ways in which these men thought about the rights and obligations of their status as free men. And so some of them will say, when asked, did anybody make you come to the camp of the 10th USCT? And they're like, yeah. I mean, I was basically at bayonet point. But I would have come soon anyway, because I wanted to serve, quote unquote, my country. Right. So there are many ideas in mind. So I think the formerly enslaved men are thinking through, from a different perspective in a different situation, some of the same questions that white soldiers and families are doing. How can I best support my family? There are men who are impressed who say things like, can I just harvest my corn first out of farm fields that have been confiscated by the government, but which they were farming for themselves? This is like they're living as autonomous people, and now the government is requiring them to serve. And while they don't like the timetable of this, and they do oppose this coercive style of enlistment, such that they refuse to participate and are made by this really bad colonel to carry a 32-pound cannonball on their shoulder for several hours. So there's resistance to this, just outright and complete resistance. But there's also like, well, if you could just give me time and let me do it on my own timetable, like I really want, I want to be involved in this effort. So I think there are many books that kind of reveal that the complex status and outlooks and aspirations that formerly enslaved people have, that must make us think of freedom in more complex terms than we generally do. But they are thinking through it, and they do think of in terms of citizenship as something that involve rights and obligations.
Right. Yeah, and I think what you're talking about too is, the complexities of these ideas of citizenship and of free labor ideology. There's choice and there's coercion.
Yeah.
There's kind of appeal and allure, and then there's also a disgust and a revulsion. It's not pure. It's not a pure celebration of this is the perfect system. In the end, people believe it's the best thing out there, and we're going to get behind it. We're going to support it. But it's by no means perfect. By no means does it work for everyone, and by no means is it free of hypocrisies.
Yeah, and I think Lincoln appreciated even in his promotion of this ideal of upward mobility. One thing he says is he's speaking in New England towns like New Haven. He says, I believe in the workers' right to strike.
Right.
That capital is the result of labor, right? Capital doesn't coerce labor. Labor kind of builds capital, but workers can go on strike, he says. And he was speaking about a particular strike that was actually happening in the shoemaking industry in New England at that time.
Yeah.
So he understands that there's conflict, but as he said, listen, this is the system in which workers can strike.
Right.
And they can't in slavery.
Right. Yeah, which again, this conversation obviously, is rooted in Lincoln as, he relates to these different big ideas. But I think that your book gives us another view, not only of, the soldiers and bounty brokers and all of that, but also of Lincoln's humanity and his decision-making processes. And the fact that, yes, he could balance the pragmatism and the idealism, and he could recognize the kind of unsavory things and yet say those unsavory things are part of the system and we got to take them, the bad along with the good, in a way that I think we can often oversimplify Lincoln, to fit whatever, agenda or story we want to tell. but he's a lot more complex than that. He, I think, appeals to a lot of different people with a lot of different worldviews because of the way he was able to relate to the more idealistic things and then the more pragmatic things, and deal head on with the negative, which is fascinating.
Yeah, that's what makes it an interesting historical subject.
Yeah.
That's why all those books are written about him. Whenever anybody says, another book about Lincoln? Do we need another book about Lincoln? I'm like, yeah, probably.
Well, I'm sure for a lot of people listening, you'd like to see more books about Lincoln as well. And there are always more topics that seem to, need to be uncovered, and ways to probe into Lincoln the man, the politician, the, commander-in-chief, to all of these different aspects of him, which, again, you got to take the bad along with the good, and process them similarly in the way that Lincoln did. So thank you, Brian, so much for joining today.
Well, thank you, Ashley.
from our living room or dining room.
Yeah. Where are we? Yeah.
And remember that we will have a live Q&A right after this video airs. So again, please submit your questions in the comment box and in the question box, and Brian will be on to happily answer your questions or respond to your comments and your feedback. So thank you again for joining us, and we will be having our next conversation with a Lincoln Scholar, I believe, in September. So we do these quarterly. They are brand new, so this is only the second one, but we will pick back up in September with our next scholar. And a reminder for those of you who are followers of the Lincoln Fellowship and you're within striking distance of Gettysburg, we are beginning the Lincoln Fellowship's 100 Nights of Taps Gettysburg 2021. The opening ceremony is on Monday, May 31st, Memorial Day. There's going to be an extended special ceremony, and then Taps will be running from then on out at 7 p.m. for 100 nights straight. Actually, even a little more than that. We go through September 11th this year for the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So please come out and join us sometime this summer for Taps every night in Gettysburg National Cemetery, 7 p.m. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you then, and definitely at our future conversations with a Lincoln Scholar, although not a spousal Lincoln Scholar. There's only one of those.
Not.
Thank you all.